It was a Sunday morning in Oxfordshire, the kind that seemed painted in quiet greys and pale gold. The River Thames moved slowly, like it had nowhere particular to go. Most people didn't notice the man sitting by the water's edge. An old coat, a small thermos, and eyes that watched the current as if waiting for an answer. The locals called him Mr. Hayes. No one knew his first name. Every morning, he sat on the same worn bench, always alone. The postman waved, children sometimes offered him crumbs for the ducks, but he never stayed long enough to finish a conversation. That Sunday, however, something changed. A boy, no older than 12, walked up with a sketchbook in hand. "You come here every day," the boy said. "Do you live nearby?" Mr. Hayes looked up, startled. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "I used to," he replied. The boy frowned. "Used to?" Mr. Hayes smiled faintly. "Some homes can't be found on a map anymore." The child didn't understand. Not yet, but that question, innocent as it was, would break open 20 years of silence. Because behind that calm river sat a man once known across London. Not for kindness, but for something darker. Something that had driven him to disappear from everything he built. As the bells of the old church struck 9, the boy's mother called him back, and the man was once again alone. Yet this time something had changed. The look in his eyes was no longer only guilt. It was a faint spark, the first in decades. He reached into his coat and unfolded an old photograph. A woman in a red coat, standing by the same river, smiling at something beyond the camera. On the back, faded ink read, "If you ever return, bring the truth with you." And that morning, for reasons he couldn't explain, Mr. Hayes finally decided to do just that. That night, rain crept quietly across the rooftops of Abingdon. Inside a narrow flat above a closet bakery, Mr. Hayes sat at a wooden desk that looked older than him. A single lamp lit the surface, and on it lay a pile of envelopes, all stamped "Return to Sender." He had written one every year, each addressed to Eleanor Shaw, the woman in the photograph, each sent to a place that no longer existed, a house demolished, a postcode erased by time. For 20 years the letters had come back, unopened, untouched. Like time itself refused to carry his apology. He ran a trembling hand across the latest one, the edges softened by rain. The ink inside had bled where his pen had paused too long. "I should have told you the truth before it was too late." But what truth? To the world, Mr. Hayes had been a respected architect, until a fire destroyed the museum he built, killing 2 people, including Eleanor's husband. He had left the country after that, vanishing before the police could decide whether it was negligence or something worse. The guilt became his address, the river, his confession booth. That night, however, something broke the pattern. A faint knock at the door. 3 slow taps. He froze. No one visited him anymore. When he opened the door, there stood the same boy from the riverside, dripping wet, holding something under his jacket. "My mum said you dropped this," the boy said, handing him a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Mr. Hayes frowned. "I haven't lost anything." The boy shrugged. "She found it in the postbox this morning. No name, just your address." Then he ran down the stairs before the man could reply. Hayes closed the door and turned the parcel over. No sender, just a single smudged word on the wrapping. Truth. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed by age. The handwriting stopped his breath. Eleanor Shaw. His knees weakened as he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet. "You disappeared before I could forgive you, but there is something you never knew. If you ever return to the river, look for the bench with no plaque. Our son deserves to know who you were." The letter trembled in his hands. Our son. Outside, the rain fell harder, like the past demanding its payment.
And at that very moment, down by the Thames, the boy, the same curious child with the sketchbook, looked back at the empty bench, not knowing that the stranger he'd spoken to that morning was his own father. The next morning the fog rolled in from the river like an old secret trying to hide itself. Mr. Hayes walked slowly along the Thames path, his coat collar turned up against the cold drizzle. The letter from Eleanor burned in his pocket. A ghost made of paper.
There were dozens of benches along the embankment, each with a plaque, in memory of, for our beloved, rest easy. But one stood apart. Its wood was unmarked, its brass mount empty, as if waiting for a name. He sat down. For the first time in years, the silence didn't comfort him. It accused him. Every creak of the river bank seemed to whisper coward. He remembered the night of the fire, the smell of paint thinner, the alarms that never rang. He had been the last to leave the building and the first to vanish. Everyone thought it was guilt, but there had been something else, something darker he had never dared to say aloud. From the fog, footsteps approached, the boy again. He carried his sketchbook, the pages spotted with rain. "You're here early," the boy said. Hayes forced a smile. Couldn't sleep. The boy sat beside him, drawing the outline of the river. "Mum says this bench used to belong to someone important." But the name fell off. Hayes froze. "What's your mother's name, lad?" "Eleanor," he replied casually, not looking up. "Eleanor Shaw." The sound of the name hit Hayes like a blow. His hands trembled, but he kept them folded in his lap. "And your father?" he managed to ask. The boy shrugged. "She says he went away before I was born. She doesn't talk about him." Hayes swallowed hard. The river blurred in front of him. For a moment he wanted to tell the truth, to say, "I never stopped writing, I never stopped looking for you." But fear chained the words in his throat. Instead, he said, "That's a fine drawing." The boy grinned. "Maybe I'll give it to Mum. She likes this place." As the child ran off, Hayes looked again at the blank space where a plaque should have been. He pulled out his pen and scratched 4 words into the wood for what remains true. The fog lifted just enough for the sun to catch the metal letters of a nearby bench. And for a moment he saw Eleanor there, as she had been 2 decades ago, smiling, alive, waiting. Then she vanished, as if the river had taken her back. Hayes knew what he had to do next. He had to face her, not the memory, but the woman herself. By the time Mr. Hayes reached a small stone house on the edge of town, the clouds had begun to break. Light filtered through in pale streaks, the kind that made the wet pavements glow like mirrors. He stood at the gate for a long time, unable to lift the latch. It had been 20 years. 20 years since he had last seen her face, since the fire, since the truth was buried under rumors and fear. But the letter, her letter, had said, "If you ever return to the river." So here he was. Through the kitchen window he saw her, Eleanor Shaw. Her hair silver now, tied back in a way that made her look both tired and strong. She was drying paintbrushes in the sink. A canvas leaned against the wall. A river scene. The same bench. The same fog. He knocked softly. No answer. A second knock, firmer this time. She turned. The moment her eyes met his through the glass, the air itself seemed to stop. Her face didn't change, no surprise, no anger, just recognition, cold and precise, like a knife sliding back into its sheath. She opened the door halfway. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "I got your letter," he replied. His voice cracked on the last word. "I didn't send it." He froze. "Then who?" "Probably him," she said, nodding toward the street where the boy's bicycle leaned against a tree. He finds things he shouldn't. The silence that followed was heavier than accusation. Hayes lowered his eyes. I didn't know about him. I swear it. I know, she said. That's the only reason you're standing here. He wanted to tell her everything. How the fire wasn't his fault, how someone had tampered with the wiring to discredit him, how he had carried her husband's death like a curse ever since. But she raised a hand. I spent 2 decades trying to hate you, she whispered. It was easier than forgiving you. Her words were sharper than shouting. He looked at the painting again. The river, the empty bench. You kept painting it, he said softly. Why? She hesitated. Because I couldn't stop seeing you there. Every time the fog rolled in, I expected you to walk out of it. The boy's voice echoed from outside. Mom, I'm going to the park. She turned toward the door, her voice steady but distant. Leave him out of it, Arthur. It was the first time she had said his name in 20 years. When the door closed behind him, Hayes didn't move. He stood there in the soft drizzle, the taste of old sorrow on his tongue. He finally understood. Forgiveness wasn't the goal. Truth was. And if he ever wanted his son to know who he really was, he'd have to dig up the one thing that still terrified him, the real cause of that fire. Arthur Hayes hadn't stepped inside the police station since the night the sirens drowned out his name. But now, 20 years later, he walked through the glass doors of the Thames Valley Constabulary, the same building that once carried his photograph on its notice board. Missing suspect, arson inquiry, 2004. The young officer at the desk barely looked up. Name, please? Hayes. Arthur Hayes. The pen slipped from the officer's fingers. You mean that Hayes? He nodded. I need to speak to whoever kept the file on the Oxford Museum fire. Minutes later, a detective appeared. Grey suit, cautious eyes. Mr. Hayes, you've got some nerve walking in here. I've got something better, Hayes replied. The truth. The detective studied him, then gestured toward a small interview room. Inside, Hayes laid a stack of yellowed letters on the table. Blueprints, notes, old correspondence with the city council. It wasn't faulty wiring, he began. It was sabotage. The fire started in the archive room, the only place I kept documents proving the museum funds were being laundered. The detective leaned forward. By whom? Hayes exhaled. Eleanor's husband, Martin Shaw. He found out I was preparing to report him. The night before the fire, he called me, told me to meet him there. He said he'd confess everything. He swallowed hard. But when I arrived, the building was already burning. The room fell silent except for the hum of the ceiling fan. You never told anyone? The detective asked quietly. I tried, Hayes said, but by then the papers had already decided who the villain was. He pushed a small metal lighter across the table. Tarnished, engraved with initials MS. I found this in the debris the next morning. I kept it. Proof, maybe. Or punishment. The detective looked at the lighter for a long time. You know this changes everything. I'm not doing it for me, Hayes said. There's a boy. He deserves to know his father isn't a coward. Outside, rain tapped against the window. Slow, steady, like an old heartbeat. When Hayes stepped out into the afternoon light, a feeling he hadn't known for decades followed him. Something almost like peace. But it didn't last, because waiting across the street under an umbrella was Eleanor. She had followed him. I knew you'd come here, she said. I read your letters. You said you never got them. I lied, she whispered. I wasn't ready to hear your truth. He handed her the lighter. Then hear this. Her hands trembled as she turned it over. tracing the initials. "I told Martin not to go that night," she said, her voice breaking. "He said someone had to clean the mess. I didn't understand until now." They stood in silence, two people bound by ashes and regret. Then Eleanor said softly, "He's painting the museum this week for a school project. Maybe it's time he knows what really happened." Hayes nodded. "Maybe it's time we both stopped hiding." And for the first time in 20 years, he looked toward the river, not as a place to hide, but as a road leading home. It was Friday afternoon at the small primary school by the river. Parents gathered in the assembly hall for the end-of-term art show. Paper lanterns hung from the ceiling, glowing softly. Laughter filled the air, innocent, ordinary, unknowing. Among the crowd stood Eleanor Shaw, her coat buttoned tight, her eyes searching every corner of the room. She hadn't told Arthur she was coming, but she had brought the lighter, the last piece of the past, wrapped in a handkerchief inside her purse. She didn't know why. Maybe to finally let it go. Then she saw him, her son Jamie, standing proudly beside his painting, a bright orange canvas streaked with grey and blue. At first it looked like a simple picture of a building on fire.
But as she stepped closer, she saw it. The details too precise for a child's imagination. The curved facade of the Oxford Museum, the clock tower, the river beside it. And standing in front of the flames, two figures. One reaching out, one turning away. Her breath caught. "Jamie, where did you learn about this place?" He smiled. "From the man by the river. He said he helped build it. He told me every corner had a story." Eleanor froze. "The man by the river? Mr. Hayes?" Jamie nodded, proud. "He said he was an architect. He gave me this pencil." He pulled it from his pocket, an old mechanical pencil with the initials AH. The hall seemed to tilt. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't breathe. All around her, parents clapped and cameras flashed, but the world had narrowed to that small pencil in her son's hand. The bridge between the man she'd loved and the child they'd created. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells. And standing beneath the bare oak tree just beyond the window was Arthur Hayes. He didn't come inside, he didn't wave. He simply watched, eyes glistening, heart caught between pride and punishment. When the show ended, Eleanor walked out to him. "You spoke to him," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to," Hayes answered. "He started drawing me. I just told him the truth about the building." She hesitated, then opened her purse. The lighter gleamed in her hand. "I can't carry this anymore," she said. "It's yours." He shook his head. "No, it's his history now, both of ours. Let him paint it right." For a long moment neither spoke. The river murmured behind them, the same as it always had. Then Eleanor said softly, "He deserves to know his father didn't run away." Hayes' eyes filled. "Not today. Let him finish his painting first. Let him see beauty before guilt." And then, for the first time, she didn't turn away. As they stood side by side, Jamie came running down the steps, waving his sketchbook. "Mom, Mr. Hayes, look, the fire's gone. I painted the river over it." Eleanor stared. The boy had repainted his work, covering the flames with calm blue water and a golden bridge. Hayes whispered, voice trembling, "He rebuilt what I destroyed." Eleanor smiled faintly. Maybe that's what sons do. A month later, the town gathered by the Thames for the opening of a new pedestrian bridge, a clean sweep of white steel that curved over the water like a quiet promise. Eleanor had been invited to speak as part of the local artist collective. Her son Jamie would unveil a mural painted by the children, but no one expected Arthur Hayes to appear.
He stood at the edge of the crowd, his head pulled low, watching the mayor cut the ribbon.
The bridge shone under the winter sun, modern, light, and alive, nothing like the heavy stone museum that had once burned his name into the papers. When Eleanor saw him, she didn't flinch, she simply nodded. An acknowledgement, not yet forgiveness, but a beginning. Jamie, nervous in his new blazer, stepped up to the microphone. "My painting is called The River Remembers," he said proudly, "because sometimes the past doesn't disappear, it just learns to flow again."
The crowd clapped politely, not grasping the weight of those words. But Eleanor did, and Arthur almost broke. When the speeches ended, Jamie ran down to the water, sketchbook under his arm. Arthur followed slowly, unsure if he was allowed, until the boy looked up and smiled. "Mr. Hayes, Mum says you used to design things. Will you help me draw a bridge someday?" Arthur knelt beside him. "I'd like that very much." Eleanor approached, her steps quiet over the gravel. She watched them draw together, the boy's small hand tracing lines, the man's steady one guiding the curve. For the first time they looked like what they were, father and son, even if the world didn't know it. When the sketch was done, Jamie grinned. "I'll call it The Bridge of Forgiveness." "Sounds good, right?" Eleanor's throat tightened. "It does," she whispered. The bells from the church across the river began to ring. Arthur rose, turning toward her. "You don't owe me peace," he said softly.
"But thank you for letting me stand here." Eleanor looked at the bridge gleaming in the sun. "I think peace isn't something we owe," she said. "It's something we share." And for a moment, time seemed to pause. The river's reflection caught the three of them, mother, father, child, framed in light, the kind that happens only when the clouds finally move aside. The past hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. No longer a flame, but a bridge.
The light over Oxfordshire had begun to fade, that soft amber hour when the world turns quiet. The river flowed steady beneath the new bridge, carrying with it the scent of rain and distant church bells. Arthur Hayes sat on his old bench, the one with no plug, watching the water catch the last traces of gold. He no longer came to hide, he came to listen. Every now and then he could hear Jamie's laughter echo from the opposite bank, where the boy and his friends sketched boats and threw pebbles into the stream. The sound didn't hurt anymore, it healed. Eleanor joined him without a word. She carried 2 cups of tea from the cafe nearby, one black, one with milk, just as she used to make it 20 years ago. "I told him today," she said quietly. Arthur turned. "Told him what?" "The truth, that his father built the museum that burned, that he left because of it, that he came back." His chest tightened. "And what did he say?" She smiled faintly. "He asked if the man by the river was still building bridges." Arthur exhaled, something between a laugh and a sigh. "I suppose I am." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the water shift and shimmer. Then Eleanor said, "You know, I once painted this place exactly as it looked the morning after the fire. Grey, empty, lifeless. But Jamie, he saw it differently. In his painting, the river glowed. Maybe the river never forgot, but it also never judged." Arthur looked toward the current. "Because the river remembers everything and forgives in its own way." A light drizzle began to fall, the kind that doesn't send anyone running, just enough to blur the distance, to soften the edges of what once was. Eleanor took the lighter from her coat, the old one with MS carved into it, and placed it gently on the bench between them. "It's time," she whispered. Arthur nodded. Together they stood and dropped it into the river. It sank without a sound, disappearing into the current that had seen everything, carried everything, and now finally kept their secret. Across the bridge, Jamie waved. "Mum, Mr. Hayes, come see what I made." They walked to him. On the railing, the boy had carved 3 small words with his pocket knife. "Forgiven by water." Eleanor looked at Arthur. "Maybe that's what we are now." He smiled, not the smile of a man seeking pardon, but of one who finally understood that forgiveness isn't given, it's lived. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the river shimmered once more, reflecting the bridge, the boy, and the 2 people who had finally found peace at its edge. And somewhere in that quiet, the river whispered, as if to itself, "I remember."